A boot slammed into the shop door and cracked the glass. A man staggered in, fists already up, shouting about money he was owed. He grabbed the first thing he could reach, a heavy chain off the wall, and swung it hard. Metal whistled through the air. It caught a workbench and sent tools scattering across the concrete. A dog barked once, low and sharp. Then a voice cut through all of it. Quiet, steady, not scared at all, not even a little. An old man stepped out from behind a half-built engine, wiping grease off his hands with a rag. Gray beard, bad knee, 58 years old. His name was Duke Marchetti, and he'd seen men like this 100 times before. He didn't reach for a weapon, he just looked. What Duke did in the next 10 seconds stopped that man cold. Stay with me on this one. Let me back up, because the man with the chain didn't come out of nowhere. Nothing ever does. Duke Marchetti ran a motorcycle repair shop on the edge of Flagstaff. This was 1994, back when a place like his still smelled of oil and coffee and nobody was in a hurry. He'd been a road captain once, years back, ran with a crew that stretched from Arizona clear out to the coast. Now he ran a garage and lived in a small apartment right above it. Just him and a dog. The dog's name was Diesel. A shepherd mix with one eye, gray around the muzzle, half an ear missing. Duke found him half-starved behind the shop one winter and never got around to finding him another home. The two of them had an understanding. Diesel slept by the space heater. Duke talked to him like a man who'd run out of other people to talk to. Duke was 58, gray beard down his chest, a bad knee that told him when the weather was turning. He didn't drink anymore, didn't chase anything anymore. He fixed bikes, he closed up at 6, he climbed those stairs, and he did it all again the next day. That was the whole shape of his life, and he'd made his peace with it, or told himself he had. The shop was his whole world now. A row of bikes in different stages of coming apart. A calendar from '92 he'd never gotten around to changing. A radio that only pulled in the country station. It suited him. He was, he figured, exactly where he belonged. Then the librarian started showing up. Her name was Cassidy Vaughn. 26 years old, worked the front desk at the county library downtown. The first time, she rolled a little scooter up to his door with a flat rear tire and a smile that didn't match the trouble she was in. Duke patched it in 10 minutes and waved off the money. He figured that was the end of it. It wasn't. 2 days later, she was back. The scooter was making a noise, she said. Duke listened. There was no noise. He tightened a bolt that didn't need tightening and sent her on her way. Then it was a flat again. Then she needed to borrow a cup of coffee, of all things, because the shop down the road was closed. Then she just happened to be passing by with 2 sandwiches and couldn't possibly eat both. Then it was a paperback book she thought he might like, then a spare battery for the radio, then a pack of the cheap black coffee grounds she'd noticed he was running low on. Now, Duke wasn't a fool. He'd been around a long time. He knew what was happening, and it made no sense to him at all, because here's the thing you have to understand. When Cassidy walked in, the first thing she did every single time was drop straight down to the floor and take Diesel's face in both hands. That mean old one-eyed dog, who growled at every man who came near the shop, would flop over like a puppy for her. And Duke would stand there watching a beautiful young woman scratch his broken dog's belly, and something in his chest would ache in a way he didn't have a name for. He let it go on for weeks. He told himself she was just lonely, just kind, just a girl who liked dogs. He was too smart to let himself believe anything else, because believing anything else at his age was the fastest way an old man could make a fool of himself. Until the afternoon she said it out loud. She was sitting on an overturned crate, Diesel's head in her lap, and she asked Duke why he never once asked her to stay for supper. And Duke put down his wrench. He wiped his hands. And he told her the truth, plain, the way you'd tell a kid not to touch a hot stove. "You're 26 years old," he said. "You've got your whole life in front of you." And you're spending it in a garage that smells like gasoline, talking to a man old enough to be your father. He pointed at his beard. He pointed at his knee. He pointed up the stairs at that lonely little apartment. You see all this. This is what's on offer here. A broke-down old rider and a broke-down old dog. You deserve better than that. You deserve young. You deserve a man who will still be standing in 30 years. Go find him. Stop wasting your good years on me. He figured that would do it. Men his age had learned that the fastest way to end a thing was to tell a person the plain, ugly truth about yourself. Cassidy didn't get up. She didn't cry. She just kept scratching Diesel's ears, slow and easy. And when she finally looked up at him, her voice was soft, but it didn't shake at all. "I'm not looking for young," she said. "I never was. I've had young. Young broke my nose once and never said sorry." She held his eyes. "I'm looking for you, Duke. To me, you're perfect." And for the first time in about 20 years, Duke Marchetti didn't have a single word to say back. He just stood there with the rag in his hand, and the shop went quiet around them, and even Diesel seemed to know something had shifted in the air. Duke had walked into rooms full of angry men without blinking. 2 words from a librarian on an upturned crate and he couldn't find the floor with both feet. Now here's where it turns. Duke should have sent her home that night. That was the smart play. Instead, he heard himself say something he hadn't said to a living soul in years. He asked her to stay for supper. They ate upstairs. Nothing fancy, eggs and toast, because that's what a bachelor keeps in the icebox. Duke had to hunt through the cabinet for a second plate that didn't have a chip in it. He found one that had belonged to his mother and stood there a second holding it before he set it down. Diesel sat between them with his chin on the table waiting for scraps, and for the first time in a long while that little apartment didn't feel empty. It felt full. Duke noticed it, and it scared him more than any man with a chain ever could. He asked her about the broken nose. She got quiet. Then she told him. There'd been a man. His name was Rourke. She'd met him when she was 22 and new in town and didn't know any better. He was older than her too, not old like Duke, but older and charming in the way that dangerous men learn to be. At first he paid for everything. Dinners, her car, the deposit on her apartment. She thought that was love. It wasn't love. It was a leash. Because every dollar Rourke spent he wrote down. And when Cassidy tried to leave him, after the night he broke her nose against a kitchen cabinet and told her she'd walked into a door, Rourke slid a piece of paper across the table. Everything he'd ever given her added up. Almost $11,000. He told her she wasn't going anywhere until every cent was paid. He told her he knew where she worked. He told her he knew where she slept. She'd been paying him back in cash, a little every month for 2 years, just to keep him quiet, just to keep him away. 2 years of skipped lunches and thrift store shoes and never once buying herself anything just because she wanted it. 2 years of watching that number come down so slow you could barely see it move. And there was more, she admitted, and this is the part that made Duke's jaw tighten. Lately Rourke had gotten worse, not better. He'd started showing up at the library at closing time, just standing across the street, watching. Twice he'd followed her car. And a week ago he'd asked her, real casual, who the old man was she kept visiting out on the edge of town. That was the first Duke heard that Rourke even knew he existed. He filed it away. He didn't say anything. But something in him, something old and cold that he'd put to sleep a long time ago, opened one eye. Duke listened to all of it without moving, and when she was done he didn't give her a speech. He just reached across that little table and put his big scarred hand over hers, and he held it. That was all. But you have to understand, Duke Marchetti hadn't reached for another human being in 20 years. For him, that was the same as jumping off a cliff. She turned her hand over and held on. "You keep telling me you're too old," she said. "You keep pointing at your beard and your knee like they're supposed to send me running. But I've been around men who were young and strong and mean. I don't want strong. I've got plenty of reasons to be scared of Strong. She squeezed his hand. You're the first man in years who's never once made me flinch. You know what that's worth. You couldn't put a price on that. And Duke, who had 100 good reasons ready and none of them worth a damn anymore, leaned across that table and kissed her. Soft, careful, like she might break or he might. When it was over, neither one of them pulled away. Now I want to be honest with you, because this is the part where an old man's whole life quietly turned over. Duke had spent 20 years convincing himself he was done, that he'd had his road and his crew and his younger days, and that the rest was just running out the clock. He'd built a fence around his heart and called it wisdom. And this girl with her library card and her flat tires and her way with a broken dog had just walked right through it like it was never there. He should have been terrified, and part of him was. But mostly, for the first time in longer than he could remember, Duke Marchetti felt like a man with something to lose, which is a dangerous thing to be. Remember that. Later, when Cassidy had dozed off on the couch, Duke stood at the window a while. On the shelf by the door was an old cigar box, and in that box was a card with a phone number on it. Half his old crew was scattered now, gray and retired like him. But there were still a few he could call, men who'd ridden 1,000 miles at his back and never once asked why. He looked at that box for a long moment. He even reached for it once, then let his hand drop. Then he told himself he was being foolish. This was a quiet town. That part of his life was over. He left the box closed. He'd think about that decision more than once in the days to come. They didn't talk about Rourke again that night. There didn't seem to be any reason to. Rourke was the past. He was a bad memory in another part of town, and up here it was warm and the coffee was on, and Diesel had finally given up on scraps and gone to sleep with his head on Cassidy's foot. Duke poured them both a cup. He sat back down. His knee didn't ache. The shop below them was locked up tight. Outside, the window flagstaff was quiet, just the hum of a streetlight and the far-off sound of a train. Cassidy leaned her head on his shoulder and he let her, and he thought, plain and simple, maybe I get to have this. Maybe it's not too late after all. For a few minutes there, everything was calm. Everything was easy. He should have known better. For about 3 days, Duke Marchetti got to be a happy man. Cassidy came by after her shifts. They took Diesel for slow walks along the tree line. Duke even caught himself whistling in the shop, and an old man whistling is a dangerous sign. It means he's forgotten to be careful. He caught his own reflection in the toolbox mirror one morning and had to look twice, because the man staring back at him was smiling, and Duke hadn't seen that man in a very long time. If you're still with me here, and I hope you are, do me one favor before we go on. Hit that subscribe button. Because what happened next is the part people don't believe when I tell it, and I want you around to hear how it ends. It fell apart on a Thursday night. Duke was locking the shop when the glass in the front door started rattling, someone pounding on it hard and fast. He opened it and Cassidy half fell inside. Her lip was split. There was blood on her collar, and she was shaking so bad she could barely get the words out. Rourke had come to the library. He'd been waiting in the parking lot when she locked up. He'd grabbed her by the arm, shoved her against her car, and when she tried to pull away, he'd backhanded her across the mouth right there under the streetlight. Then he'd leaned in close, calm as anything, and told her the terms had changed. He wanted all of it now. $11,000, every cent, inside of 1 week. He said if I didn't have it, Cassidy whispered, he'd come collect it from my new boyfriend instead. The old one, out on the edge of town. She grabbed Duke's shirt. He knows about you, Duke. He knows exactly where you are. Now most men, when they hear a thing like that, they get loud. They shout, they punch a wall, they make big promises. Duke didn't do any of that. He got quiet, real quiet. He sat Cassidy down on the crate. He got a wet rag for her lip, and while he cleaned the blood off her face, his hands were as steady as a surgeon's. But inside, That old cold thing had both eyes open now. It was awake, and it was measuring, the way it used to measure back in the old days when a decision could cost a man his life. That night Cassidy begged him to let it go. She said she'd find the money somehow. She said she'd disappear, leave town, that she'd done it before and Duke shouldn't get dragged into her mess. She kept saying she wasn't worth it, his shop, his safety, his quiet life. And that, of all things, was what finally made Duke Marchetti raise his voice. "Now you listen to me," he said. "You walked in here and told an old man he was perfect. You remember that. You looked at everything the whole world threw away and you called it perfect." His voice cracked just a little. "Well, I'm looking at you the same way. And I am not handing you back to a man who splits your lip and calls it love. Not while I'm still breathing. So you can stop telling me what you're worth. That's my call now." She stopped arguing after that. She stayed the night on the couch, with Diesel curled against her, and Duke sat up in the chair by the window with a wrench in his hand, watching the road until the sun came up. He walked over to the shelf that morning. He opened the cigar box. He took out the card with the phone number on it, and he stood there holding it, thinking about a promise he'd made himself years ago that he was done with all that. Then he looked at the blood still on Cassidy's collar and he put the card in his shirt pocket. He didn't get to make the call that day, because Rourke didn't wait a week. Rourke never meant to. That afternoon, a black truck rolled up to the shop and two men climbed out with a third one behind them. The third one was Rourke. Big, thick through the shoulders, a nice leather jacket, the kind of man who smiles while he ruins your day. He walked into that garage like he owned it. His two friends spread out behind him. One of them had a tire ironed down against his leg. The other one had his hand tucked inside his jacket, and he made sure Duke saw the shape of it there. Diesel came up growling, hackles high, and one of the men drew back a boot to kick him. Duke stepped between them before it landed. Didn't say a word, just stepped in and stood there. Rourke looked him up and down, the gray beard, the bad knee, the grease on his hands, and he laughed. He actually laughed. He said he'd expected more from the way Cassidy talked. He said he'd give the old man one chance to stay healthy. 11 grand by Friday, or he'd take it out of the shop, and the dog, and anybody standing in the way. Then he knocked a row of tools off the bench with his arm just to make his point and strolled back out to his truck like a man without a care in the world. Duke watched the truck pull away. Then he walked to the phone on the wall. He dialed a number he hadn't called in 9 years. Somebody picked up on the third ring, and all Duke said was, "It's Marchetti. I need the family, and I need 'em Friday." There was a long pause on the other end. Then a voice Duke hadn't heard since the last funeral said, "Captain, where do you want us?" Friday came, and it came slow. Duke sent Cassidy upstairs and told her to stay there with the door locked no matter what she heard. She didn't want to. He made her. Diesel he kept downstairs with him because that dog wouldn't have stayed up those stairs for anything in the world, not with his man out in the open. What Rourke didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the night before the family had come. They'd rolled in after dark, 1 and 2 at a time, headlights off the last block so nobody would hear. Old men, most of them. Gray beards, bad backs, big bellies. Men Duke had ridden with 30 years ago. They parked their bikes in the empty lot behind the shop, out of sight from the road, and they waited. They didn't ask many questions. When one of your own calls and says he needs the family, you don't ask why. You just come. That's what the word means. So when that black truck pulled up Friday afternoon, the shop looked exactly the way it always looked. Quiet, sleepy. One old man and one old dog. Rourke came in alone this time. Cocky. He'd left his 2 friends by the truck. He figured he didn't need them for this. "Where's my money, old man?" Duke was standing behind a half-built engine, wiping his hands on a rag. He didn't answer. He just looked at him. And that not answering, that quiet, was what set Rourke off. His eyes went to the wall where a heavy toe chain hung on a hook. He grabbed it, wrapped it twice around his fist, and he swung. The chain whistled through the air and caught the corner of the workbench and sent a tray of tools crashing across the concrete. Diesel barked once, low and sharp, and lunged, and Duke said one word, "Down," and the dog held. Then Duke moved. "Now I told you he had a bad knee. I told you he was 58. But there's a thing about men who used to be dangerous. It never really leaves them. It just goes to sleep." And Duke had spent his whole younger life on the wrong side of rooms exactly like this one. Rourke reared back to swing again, and Duke stepped in, not away, in, right inside the arc of the chain where it had no power. He caught Rourke's wrist with one hand, turned it the way a wrist doesn't want to go, and the chain hit the floor. Then he put his forearm across the man's chest and walked him back into the roll-up door hard enough to knock the wind clean out of him. It took about 10 seconds. Rourke went from swinging that chain to pinned against the door gasping, and he never landed a single blow. That's what stopped him cold, not the strength of it, the ease of it. The way the old man did it without hurry, without heat, like he'd done it 1,000 times, which he had. But Duke didn't hit him. That's the part I want you to hear. He had him pinned, helpless, and he didn't throw a single punch. He just leaned in close, the same way Rourke had leaned into Cassidy under that streetlight, and he said, real soft, "You don't ever say her name again." And then he let go. He stepped back, and he nodded toward the open bay door. Rourke's 2 friends had come running when they heard the crash, but they'd stopped dead in the lot. Because rolling in from behind the shop, filling that whole lot, blocking the black truck in on every side, was a wall of motorcycles. 20, maybe more. 20 old men off their bikes now, standing shoulder to shoulder, arms crossed, not saying a word. Just there, just looking. Rourke's friends got in the truck and locked the doors. Rourke stood in the middle of that shop and finally understood what he'd walked into. He'd come to lean on a lonely old man with no one in the world. And the lonely old man had a family 100 strong, and had just chosen not to use it to hurt him. One of the brothers had already called the sheriff. Turned out a couple of them still had friends in that office too. The cruisers rolled up 10 minutes later, no lights, no siren, and the deputy who stepped out took one look at that lot full of gray beards and nodded like he'd expected exactly what he was seeing. Down in the lot, the family didn't cheer. That's not how those men are. They just started their engines, one after another, that big rolling thunder climbing up into the mountains, and a few of them clapped Duke on the shoulder on their way out. And one old boy with a white beard down to his belt buckle looked at Cassidy and looked at Duke and just grinned and said, "About time, Captain." Then they rode off the way they came. When it was over, when the deputies had Rourke in the back of a car and were taking statements about assault and threats and the split lip he'd put on Cassidy the night before, Duke went up those stairs. Cassidy opened the door before he could knock. She'd heard all of it. She threw her arms around his neck and held on like she was drowning. And Duke, holding her, finally said the thing he'd been too proud and too scared to say. "I told you I was too old for you," he murmured into her hair. "I was wrong. I wasn't too old, I was just too afraid." He pulled back and looked at her, that split lip, those eyes. "You said I was perfect, I'm not. But I swear to you, I'll spend whatever years I've got left trying to be worth the way you look at me." Rourke never got his $11,000. What he got was a court date and then another one. Turned out a debt built on threats and a broken nose doesn't hold up to much daylight. One of Duke's brothers had a son who was a lawyer down in Phoenix, and that young man drove up on a Saturday, looked over everything Rourke had ever made Cassidy sign, and started laughing, the tired kind of laugh. There was no real debt. There never had been. It was just a cage a cruel man had built out of paper and fear. The lawyer tore it up in an afternoon. In its place came a restraining order, an assault charge, and a couple of other things Rourke's past caught up with once people started actually looking. He left Flagstaff not long after. Cassidy never saw him again. And here's the thing about the money she'd been paying him all those years, a little at a time. She stopped. And for the first time in a long time, that girl could breathe. Now let me tell you how the rest of it went, because I know that's what you're really here for. Cassidy kept her job at the library. Duke kept the shop. But the walking home part changed. Now she walked home to the little apartment above the garage, where an old man and a one-eyed dog were always waiting, and where the icebox had a lot more than eggs in it these days. Something else changed too. Duke started calling the family again. Not for trouble, just to call. He'd let all those men drift out of his life over the years, one by one, telling himself they were better off without a used-up old captain hanging around. Turned out they'd been waiting on him the whole time, same as he'd been sitting up there alone. A few of them started riding up on Sundays. Cassidy would make a pot of coffee big enough to float a boat, and that little shop would fill up with old thunder and old stories, and Duke would sit in the middle of it with his wife under one arm, shaking his head at how close he'd come to missing all of it. They got married in the spring, out behind the shop, in that same lot where 20 bikes had once rolled in to save them. Most of the family came back for it, fewer of them every year now, but they came. Cassidy wore her mother's dress. Diesel wore a bow tie he tolerated for exactly 11 minutes. And when the old boy with the white beard asked Duke if he took this woman, Duke Marchetti, who'd spent 20 years believing he had nothing left worth giving anybody, had to stop and clear his throat twice before he could get the word out. He never pointed at his beard again. Never pointed at his knee or those stairs or called himself broke down. He'd stopped keeping score against himself the day he understood that she'd never been keeping score at all. Cassidy used to tease him about it. She'd catch him at the mirror some mornings looking at the gray in his beard, and she'd come up behind him and put her arms around him and say the same thing she said that first day on the shop floor. "To me, you're perfect." And every time the old man believed it a little more. Diesel got old, the way dogs do too fast. His muzzle went from gray to white. But he never once had to sleep alone by that space heater again, and neither did Duke. Most nights that old dog slept at the foot of the bed with the two of them, snoring loud enough to wake the dead, and nobody ever had the heart to move him. That front door got a new pane of glass, by the way. The one Rourke cracked. Duke put a little bell on it so he'd hear when someone came in. And every evening at 6 he'd lock up and climb those stairs that didn't feel so lonely anymore, with the dog thumping up behind him. You want to know the strangest part? For 30 years Duke had told himself the best of his life was behind him. All that road, all that thunder, the whole loud younger man he used to be, gone, he figured, and good riddance. But it wasn't the loud years that saved him in the end. It was a quiet girl with a flat tire who kept finding excuses to come back, who looked at everything the world had used up and thrown away, and decided it was exactly what she wanted. He tried so hard to send her off to someone younger, someone whole, someone who'd still be standing in 30 years. He never did understand, not until the very end of that long story, that she'd already found the only man she was looking for. He was standing right there in the doorway the whole time, grease on his hands, telling her she deserved better. She didn't want better. She wanted him. And in the end, that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.